Welcome back to Chapter 6 of My Dad's Life. This is a year-long project to put down in video form what is in his book he wrote about his life. Chapter 6 deals with life after college. So we're going to get into all kind of details of that time period. It should be lots of fun. Stick around. I know you'll enjoy it. We are back for Chapter 6. This chapter is called Marriage, Career, Family, and Law School. So a lot of it's going to focus on your first marriage to my mom, Pat Lupo. Why don't we talk about how you guys met through Ronnie and Bonnie Schiff and how you guys dated and what happened?
Ronnie Schiff was my high school buddy, and his sister Bonnie. Of course, I knew her through him, and when I was getting ready for college, I met your mom. I was still in high school, and we had a date that summer, and it didn't go very well. It was at Glen Echo, and neither one of us enjoyed it too much, and that was the end of what we thought would be the end of that relationship or dating. A year or so later, I'm in college, and Pat has now graduated high school, and for whatever strange reason, we came together with Ronnie and Bonnie one night, and we just went out for whatever, I don't know, ice cream, whatever. And it went much better, so we dated. Pat, at that time, was still in high school. I was first-year engineering student. I had finished a year of engineering. She just finished high school, that's right. And she would work for the next year or so as a dental assistant. And she went to college at West Liberty State University when I entered I think my third year or second year of engineering. 60 years ago plus. It's kind of hard to remember exactly the years. But she went off to school in West Liberty, and that's outside of Pittsburgh. And
I think it's in West Virginia.
It is in West Virginia, but it's outside of Pittsburgh. It's not too far from Pittsburgh.
What was dating like in the 1950s? Like when you dated a girl in high school, how were you allowed to be alone with her? Like, weren't parents super protective back then? And
well, I don't know that the parents were super protective, but the whole mores were quite different. It was before the sexual revolution, for one. You didn't have the exposure to sex that you have had in movies since the 1960s, late 60s, and especially on the internet since the 2000.
Sure.
And there was still a very innocent age going on. Not until the Kennedy assassination, which we get to later, did things really change in the Vietnam War. So,
were teenagers having sex, or was it super taboo back then? Like, what was happening?
I guess it varied, but it sure as hell wasn't anything like it is now, where you have to make sure that your kids, when they're in their early teens, understand all the nuances of sex. We talked about this in one of the earlier interviews we had. But no, it was much more casual and much more restricted in the sense that you had to be pretty serious long into a relationship to even think about sex then. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Everybody thought about sex.
But to actually have a girl do it with you. Yeah, I know the guys would have no problem trying to have that, but I thought the girls were much more difficult back then too.
Oh, I think
to have sex.
Yeah, sure.
Understandable.
Very different than now.
So tell me about how you got married, why you got married, and what was that ceremony like in the 50s? Like, what's a typical wedding back then compared to now?
I don't know what a typical wedding was like then. I can tell you what mine was like because it was the first wedding that I'd ever been to. Not like now where it seems like everybody has fancy weddings and you go to a lot of weddings. But I finished engineering school. We hopped through engineering school here, and that's fine because I think I already talked about it. I finished engineering school, and we got married the week after I graduated. Leo, Pat's dad, was a commander in the Navy, retired, and he had worked at the National War College at Fort McNair, which is in Washington by the Potomac River. He got the officers club for the reception, and we had the wedding in Vienna at the Wesley Methodist Church, and my fraternity brothers, a bunch of people came. I would guess 200 or 300 people, and it was, to me, you just show up. It's I don't know what it's like for guys today, but at 22 years old, you just show up. And the morning, what I do remember about it is my best man, Don Edens, who I've mentioned before with regard to engineering school. He stayed over the night before. The so-called bachelor party was the 6 or 7 of us that were in my party, the men's party. We went out to some club that had music, and just had beer and watched the performers. But Don stayed overnight. The next morning, we got a bottle of very cheap 7-Eleven wine. It was like $1 a bottle, Dole Haven Rosé. And we're putting it down, and we're dressing in my bedroom. We're both in there. And my Aunt Ida walked in, and she was horrified because she figured I'd never make it to the wedding drinking this whole bottle of cheap wine. So anyway, we went to the wedding. It was a very hot day. It was in June, but very hot. Pat was an hour late, or maybe more.
Because these are like when there was no air conditioning in churches
no
and things
air conditioning,
like that. So
yeah.
everybody's
and people are out there wondering what the hell's going on. So I'm told.
Yeah, because she's an hour late.
I'm out with I'm in some side room where they hold you off until they need to bring in the guy to marry. and I'm putting some humor into it, but anyway, that was it. Finally, there's the wedding, and we got in the car. We had a convertible, and we drove down to Fort McNair. We were there at the reception. It seemed like no time at all. They're kicking us out. Some stuff about married couples have to get out and get on the road.
I remember that as a little kid, the people would never stay to the end of their own wedding.
Yeah, and
then as adults now, everybody stays at their own wedding because they don't want to leave their own party.
Well, it's also because the bride and groom by that time have probably lived together for a year or two.
I guess traditionally this was the first night they want to have sex and they want to get the hell out.
200 years ago, that's probably true. But
anyway, ready to leave.
Anyway, so they, we left, and I heard from my fraternity brothers later on there was a pretty good party. But it wasn't a sit-down wedding. It wasn't one of these things where people, my recollection 60 years later, where people get up and say silly things about, I've never had a friend like this guy.
Right. No big toast. Did you have bands, or did you have
I don't think there was a band.
Dancing or nothing?
I don't think there was a band.
So you basically just came, sat.
It was big.
Said, hey.
But it was big because of the number of people. And then there was a big table and lots of booze.
Okay. So they did have beer there.
Oh, and they had booze, not just beer. Yeah.
And that's how your fraternity brothers actually got lucky with the bridesmaids.
Presumably, I wasn't there to make sure.
That's a big deal back then.
Yeah.
So let's move on to your first big job at the General Electric Company. You worked for GE?
Yes. And
what'd you do?
Well, I was hired as part of what was called a marketing training program. And it's funny they use the word marketing, I guess because you were in GE, there were different departments, and some engineering departments sold product. And I was in power. I had an electrical engineering degree, and electronics weren't a big thing yet. Power was huge, it still is. And so my first job as in this program, you're sent every 3 months to a different location in your first year. And then the second year you go for a full year, and then third year you're permanent, so-called permanent. My first job was in Philadelphia. Your mom and I moved to Philadelphia, and it was at Penn Center. And I kind of tagged along with this fella, Ed McGee, who would go out to various power stations in the Delaware, Pennsylvania area and talk to the engineers there, because the deal was that if you had a good relationship, it was either GE, your company, or Westinghouse that was going to get a $30 million power generator order the next time they built another generator. So you might only get a sale once or twice a year, but $30 million in 1964 was enormous. And so I kind of learned how to schmooze the clients, who were also engineers, and just basically kept quiet and listened, because these guys were power engineers, and I didn't really know a lot about power other than basic electrical engineering. After 3 months, Pat and I moved to Schenectady, New York. The whole town of Schenectady was General Electric. That was its main headquarters. And that's where they built the generators, many of which are all over the United States. Westinghouse and Alice Chalmers and GE built most of the generators in this country before nuclear. There was no nuclear yet. And that was a job of actually testing. These are enormous generators.
They're like the steam turbine.
Correct.
Giant ones. Okay.
Yeah, you know, you're walking 100 feet of length on one generator and 30, 40 feet up, and inside are the blades spinning, and there's a shaft, a long shaft, 50 feet long, that weighed maybe 50 tons, that everything was mounted on. And it was on both ends there were journals that would hold this long shaft in between, and you'd spin it up at, I don't know, 6,000 RPM, whatever it was. But you had to test this thing first. And so in the plant, not only did they build it, they put it into a pit. And this other engineer and I, Lou Fagan, we were the engineers that tested and approved the rotor. It's called a rotor. And what we would do is there were 6-inch sliding metal doors that would close over this thing, and then we'd start it up and bring it up and then watch the vibrations. And when the vibrations would get too strong at a certain frequency, we'd bring it back down. We'd mark the angles that happened, and we'd actually open the pit, go down with a hammer and some weights and bang it into the areas where we thought would balance it, and go back and take it up again.
That sounds like a dangerous job.
Well, it was a dangerous job. Yeah. 2 years before, one of them blew up, and the two engineers in the very job that we had were blown through the ceiling of the General Electric plant and killed. And so that's why they put these 6-foot thick
glass doors.
Yeah. But we were stupid enough at 23, 22, I guess I was 22 then, to think that we could beat the being afraid of this job aspect by going to the bar ahead of time.
Of course.
So, you know, we volunteered because it paid more to be on the swing shift at night, and it was in the winter, just before the first of the year in December. They want to get everything out the door to book it on their books for the year. So they go on working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, building these power plants and these generators, and the building was enormous. I mean, it was like a mile long. So we go to the Joe and Mary's bar. Lou picked me up at 5 o'clock, and we go to Joe and Mary's bar, and Joe and Mary's bar is about the size of this room, and we'd have whiskey sours, because we were stupid enough to think that whiskey sour was a good drink, you know. This is real adult time.
Hey, man, this is solid logic for a 22-year-old. You're invincible if you get drunk at work.
Oh, my God. So we'd have a couple of these things and go into work, and that would supposedly calm us down. Well, we're making these calculations. There was no such thing as a computer. There was no such thing as a calculator. So we're out there with slide rules, making these calculations. We're really doing real engineering. You know?
Is a slide rule like an abacus? Like what
No,
is?
it's much more complicated than that. It's and actually I have one. It's a shame I don't have it here to show you. I have my dad's, but it has a sliding part of the scale, and it has 4 or 5 different scales where you can figure cube roots, square roots, cosine formulas, all kinds of stuff, and very sophisticated. But you know, a little handheld calculator for an engineer these days can do more than that thing could do.
Right, for sure.
Just amazing what people can do today. But anyway, so we go to this job and get through the night somehow. And then on the way home, we get out at 6 in the morning and we go to Joe and Mary's and bang on the door. One of them would get up, and there's 4 or 5 of us. You know, it wasn't just Lou and me. We'd meet there, and we'd have a couple more whiskey sours. And I go home, crash like at 10 o'clock, get up at 3 o'clock, spend time with Pat, and then go off at 5 o'clock for Joe and Mary's again. For all I knew, I could have become an alcoholic in the 3 months. You know,
That's solid logic.
It was a scary job.
Now, you were talking about, just for relevance, what did your first job pay a year? And you remember, you list some figures in the book.
Yeah, my recollection is it was $7,200 a year or something like that, $7,000. But when I went and started working on the night shift, I got double time for everything over 40 hours and 2.5 times for everything over on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. So instead of going with like $120 check on Fridays, or less than that, I guess, if you pay taxes, $100, going by the bank and cashing it, because that's what we used to do, I'd be showing up at the bank with grease all over me and with my buddies, and we'd be coming in with $300 check. You know, I felt rich. This was amazing. And the same clerk would wait on me each time, just kind of look at me like, what the hell's this guy with all this grease making all this money? So there was a 3-month period, and very early on, where we were making a lot of money. It doesn't sound like much today, but that was a lot of money. And in fact, it was so much money that Pat went out and bought a Pfaff knitting machine that did rugs. It was like this big. And,
oh, wow.
And,
like a loom.
Yeah, and I don't know what else we got. But, you know, we were rich.
Well, you also said after, I guess you got tired of that death-defying job, that you then moved on to something to do with AM and FM radio, because back in the day, I guess FM really wasn't a thing yet. And tell me about that.
Okay, we're out of sequence.
Oh, it's the next...
Well, actually, that was when I was in engineering school. I had my first engineering job was as an engineering aide at the Federal Communications Commission. And the place I worked was called Applied Propagation. Strange. Propagation being wave propagation.
Oh.
At that time, television only had VHF stations, 13 stations. And there were usually 3 networks in a major city, and that was it. And the idea was, could there also be UHF television, starting at channel 14 and going up to 60 or 70, increasing greatly the amount of usability of televisions. So this division researched that entire question for a bunch of years. And what they did is they'd send out a signal from the Empire State Building in New York in various directions, out into Pennsylvania, out 100 miles, 80 miles, behind buildings, in crevices, and they'd take measurements. They'd go around in a truck and take measurements. Those measurements would come in paper rolls, and they'd be bars. Like if the signal was this tall on a paper this tall, that was a strong signal. Might be this tall, this tall. So I would take these, my engineering aid job was to sit there at a machine while this thing went underneath a light measuring the bars at various levels, and then calculate on maps the line of the signal, and make multiplications and give those figures to the real engineers. I was only a sophomore for engineer. The guys that really had degrees and knew what they were doing, they made a report, testified before Congress years after I left that job, And that's how UHF television came into being. The Congress then required television manufacturers to include UHF television.
I only remember like 3 channels on UHF. I remember Chapter 20, Channel 20 here, yeah. And I think 32 maybe was Nova or something.
Yeah, there were 3 or 4. They could have had 20. It was expensive to set up a television station, especially on UHF, because no one was ready for it. You know, watching Howdy Doody on NBC, the kids, they don't care about UHF.
No.
So
now we're going to talk about the Kennedy assassination. You were telling me earlier that, you know, when you grew up in the 50s, it was kind of more lighthearted, and then everything changed during this event. So tell me what happened.
Well, we were living in Schenectady, and that was a fun 3 months for more than the reasons I just talked about in the power plant. But I was washing the car outside of the apartment we had, and the woman who lived in the apartment below us came running out yelling, Ray, Kennedy has been shot. He's been shot. She had a German accent. It was a little hard to understand, but I got it. And raced inside. Pat wasn't there. She was having a lesson on this knitting machine down in Schenectady, 4 or 5 miles away. And within minutes, we learned that he not only was shot, he was going to die. He did die. So I went down and got Pat and drove down because I don't think, had heard it yet. Not everybody had TVs on at that time. And brought her home, and we watched it on television. And, of course, the next 3 or 4 days all meld into one memory. People my age will all tell you that's one of the 2 or 3 questions they can remember answering. One of the 2 or 3 moments in their lives. They can remember exactly where they were when they heard that Kennedy was assassinated. And that was one of mine. And it was, you know, just an incredibly depressing experience. And for whatever strange reason, again, without a lot of maturity and knowledge, I hooked the idea that Dallas was where the assassination occurred. And somehow I thought that was something that signaled the hatred, bigotry against blacks. It really didn't have anything to do with it. But because it was at the same time that we were starting to really learn about what the awful stuff going on in the South, the way they treated blacks and all that, I made that connection. And it was an improper connection. It really had nothing to do with it. But for quite a few years, I held on to that, including probably after the time Martin Luther King was assassinated 5, 6 years later, in Memphis. But anyway, it's a side issue. The point is, it changed America. The Kennedy assassination changed America. And it came right about the time, 2 or 3 years ahead of us really getting majorly involved in Vietnam. And we were the last country to go into Vietnam. Most people today don't realize that the French were there long before us. Dwight Eisenhower committed troops in there before Kennedy. But all of that progresses on to be blamed a lot on Lyndon Johnson. And that's a subject for another day. But it was a very complicated decade, and it really starts in the Kennedy assassination. The innocence of this country, the kind of music that you heard, even the rock and roll, was just so different then versus 5 years later, 1968, when the Vietnam era was going on. And the difference in rock and roll, drugs, everything is very prevalent.
Do you have your own conspiracy theories about why Kennedy got shot?
No, I read with great interest the Warren Commission report, where they said that Lee Harvey Oswald did it by himself. Of course, saw what's his name?
Oliver Stone,
JFK, a very interesting movie, very creative and very well done. I mean, who in the hell knows? Castro died this past 2 weeks. And, I even saw something on one of the rag sheets that they sell at the store that always has all these lies on it, saying that Castro admitted as he died that the Cubans were responsible for Kennedy's assassination. It's probably Globe magazine. You know, Globe has had very...
I got all my news from Weekly World News with Bad Boy and all the good stuff. Do you remember that that Grandma used to buy those magazines?
She used to buy the Inquirer, I think.
I remember getting a Weekly World News and trying to talk with her about that the stories were real about Bad Boy or whatever it was. That was great. It was some good memories of stealing her old crappy magazine. I think she got a number of them. She got the Inquirer. And I remember if you guys don't know this, there was all these trash magazines back in the day where they really didn't factually check stories very well. You could just, you could call them with any story and they'd kind of put it in.
You still get the same thing. And you go through the supermarket. The Inquirer, everybody jokes about the Inquirer, but it is closer, maybe 50% close to the truth in its stories. But you get the Globe and this other one you mentioned, if they're 10%, that's amazing.
Tops, yeah. But they were really entertaining. I had a subscription to them in college just so we'd get drunk and laugh about it.
Yeah.
So the next part of this, we're going to talk about you moving back to Philadelphia in 1963. So tell me about that.
Yeah, my third General Electric assignment was at the switchgear plant in General Electric in 69th and Elbow in Philadelphia. And again, so-called marketing program, but I was really doing engineering sales. But I had to know the products. I had to learn the products and what they did. And it wasn't these large power plants then. It was more like motors for manufacturers of air conditioners. Also, on the other end of the scale, kind of like train cars, small ones that went into coal tunnels, and you know, the power systems that projected them and the lighting and everything. So you know, I was getting a real nice versatility of stuff at General Electric, and that was my third assignment. When that was over, this is where I lead into the patent office. When that was over, I was called in by GE. It was close to the end of my first year to tell me that I had excellent reviews, and they were so pleased with my work that this is a sales pitch they probably gave every guy. But you know, you don't know any better. You're listening. Oh boy, I'm good. And they said, we're offering you the 2 best positions for your 1-year assignment that we have. 2 very new products. And the first was something called nuclear power plants in San Diego, California. GE was entering the nuclear field. And I don't know if there was a nuclear power plant anywhere running at the time. Probably was. But then the second was in Phoenix, Arizona, something called mainframe computers.
Wow.
So, okay. So I'm not sure what I'd have done for that year at each one of those assignments. I'm sure it would have been very good. They're not wasting their money on, they want to teach you for a purpose. And I had this book of GE assignments, and I looked at them, and I told the guy, I said, well, these are very interesting, but I see this one back in Washington called a patent program, where the engineers are paid to write patent applications, and their law school is paid for at night. I'm kind of interested in that. The only reason I knew about patents was because my dad was a patent examiner. And the guy said, nah, you don't want to mess with that. That's for the really bright guys.
Oh,
you know, and I'm kind of looking over my shoulder. No, are there any bright guys in this room?
Oh, yeah, I like how they send the non-bright guys to work on nuclear power,
yeah, right? So anyway, a couple of weeks later, Pat and I went down to D.C., I guess to see her mom, who wasn't well at the time. And I went to the patent office and applied and got a job immediately. And came back and withdrew from GE after 1 year. They were very kind to me, you know, tried to convince me to stay and all that. But I was out. And I think the reason that I was out is because I really was never meant to be an engineer. It's really kind of strange, It's just, I never really loved the engineering work, even there with the thing spinning in the pit and making calculations and drinking whiskey sours to make sure those calculations were correct. But I just, and I really didn't want to go to law school. I don't even know why that was of interest. That's another story to get to later, how I got to law school. But just maybe because I'd seen my dad go through this job, he liked it. I used to hear him talk about it. It was a chance to get back to Washington where all my buddies were. So,
Well, I'm a little confused. Was this program sponsored by GE that allowed you to become a patent examiner? And
not patent examiner, you were a patent trainer. You were training to become a patent attorney. And they taught you how to write a patent application. Your work was reviewed by patent lawyers that GE hired. And you would do the searching, you would write the technical description. And, we're teaching you how to do this, which is not an easy thing either. And GE had, at that time, was one of the 10 biggest filers of patent applications in the country, along with IBM, Exxon, and it was almost all American countries, and the Japanese were not as prominent. And so I think that was basically it.
I'm just a little confused. Who's paying for you to go to night school and get your?
Yeah, if you go to GE, they paid for it. Yeah.
So that you were still technically working for GE in Washington.
Yeah, full time, and then you go to night school, and they'd pay for that. And then when you graduated, you became a patent attorney for General Electric, which was a nice paying job and a good job, but it wasn't. It was the end of my doing engineering. For the rest of my life and all of the stuff I've done, engineering's been connected. Incredibly important to my career. But important because it let me understand various technologies that other people would have struggled to learn. Because the principles of all engineering, whether it's mechanical, electrical, or civil, are the same. There's a lot of math in engineering, a lot of recognition of solving problems. And so later on as a lawyer, I worked with the inventors and my expert witnesses and getting them ready to go before a jury. And so, I spoke the language immediately. And then I would get them to try to tone down to speak the language more so maybe a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old could understand the invention and understand how to make it, but would understand its significance. So anyway, that's how I got the patent office.
Okay, there's one more thing you wanted to add to that.
To put some perspective on all of that, the decisions, and the first job, major job, the decision to get married. When you look back and you think that those decisions, not just by me, but by so many people, are made when they're 21, 22, 23 years old, it's a wonder that there's ever a good reason for any of it. It's just like we do these things by instinct. And it might apply even when you're making decisions at 50. But why did I choose General Electric? I guess because I wasn't offered at that time, other than the Federal Communication Commission, government, I wasn't offered a Washington, D.C. engineering job. I applied to 2 places in the D.C. area. One was the Applied Physics Lab up in Maryland, and the other was a new company, small company, in Shirlington. And I got an offer from the one in Shirlington, but it wasn't much money. But the job offers came from the big companies. I got an offer from General Electric, from Westinghouse. I forget who else. I had 3 or 4 offers out of Washington. And GE, because of Ronald Reagan probably, because he used to do the Ronald Reagan show on TV, he'd do the commercials before he was ever president. GE had a nice reputation from a human standpoint, as a kid watching GE theater and things like that. So
I
anyway,
didn't realize GE hosted stuff like in my day it was Mutual of Omaha that did all the
that was the guy about the zoo,
yeah
Marvin something.
something like that.
Marlin.
I don't remember. I just remember seeing that, and I was like, "What the hell is Mutual of Omaha?"
Yeah.
So it was all feel good. Okay, so we're gonna move on to Tony being born. So you're how old when you have your first kid here? Tony is born July 10th, 1964.
So I was 22.
You're 22. Okay, and that's kind of common back then. You had a kid when you were young. You're still pretty much a kid yourself.
Yeah. And you know, the whole routine, you know, you're asking about dating and everything. The whole routine in my early years in the 50s and everything was you went to school, you got married, you had kids, you ended up with a couple kids, a couple cars, nice house, then you retire. And, you know, when you're 60 and life's good, and then you die at 68. If you're lucky to get to that point. But yeah, so, okay, Tony comes into the world in July of 1964, and I'm 22.
So tell me about Tony being born, that experience, and you said that he was having problems like in the book
Tony.
we always were dealing with diapers, rings, and colic, and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, poor Tony, in his first 6 months, was screaming with pain in his stomach at times, just bending over backwards, holding his stomach. And it seems like it was forever that we kept going to the baby doctor, pediatrician, Yates.
Dr. Yates, that's who I went to. Yeah.
Great guy. And trying different things. Finally, it was a particular type of soybean, awful milk that calmed him down. I joke at times, because there's a little bit of truth in it, that if I gave him a little beer, about that much, that somehow, I guess the gas and everything helped him somehow. But that might be my exaggeration and might be a bad memory.
No, I think a lot of parents also used to stick their pacifiers in alcohol, like a little rum or a little something, just to suck to calm the baby down.
But
that's right. Good parenting.
Yeah, you really don't know anything about being a parent. At least I didn't. Pat did, I guess.
Well, was she breastfeeding, or was that not a thing back then?
No, she breastfed. You ask a good question, because she did breastfeed, but she also went to work. And so that might have, you'll have to ask her. It's a long time ago.
I was just curious if
Tony, that might have put her...
When he stopped breastfeeding is the reason he got sick? Or
that could be. And all I know is that it was like it seems like 6 months. This poor kid is just going awful. I mean, it's awful. You can't tell him what's wrong. He doesn't understand. You know, it's true with all babies. I guess they call it colic. I don't know what the hell they call it. None of the other boys were that sick that I remember.
Now, we've got a picture in here of Tony being born, and it's the only shot I can remember where all four grandparents are there, I think.
That's correct.
And it is 1964, 65, you said it took a picture.
Well, it's Christmas, obviously, with the outfit that we have on Tony. So he was born in 64, so it has to be the end of 64. But Doris was still alive. And that's Leo on the left, and then Doris. And that's the only picture we have of Doris that I'm aware of with any of the kids. We may have others, but those are the four grandparents. And that's it. That's it, the only picture. Doris died 1967. Tom was just before Tom was born. 1966. Yeah, August 66.
Then you have some funny stories about Tony when you were young with him, about going to Nags Head in North Carolina. And you want to tell me about that?
Yeah, our college buddy, the Gallianis, Al Galliani, had a little girl, and Don Ardell had a little girl, and then we had Tony. When you have kids at that young age, you lose all your single buddies, and you end up finding the friends that you had before that are in the same situation that you're in. They've lost their single buddies, and you start running around with other couples that have babies. So we went to the beach in Nags Head, got a small little cabin right on the water, the 3 couples and the 3 babies. So Tony, to this day, is remembered by both Al Galliani and Don Ardell in our 70s years later for his performance one day.
What did he do?
What did he do? Well, I guess he took off his diaper when none of us were looking, and he went behind a curtain, and unfortunately, my running shoes were there, and he crapped in my running shoes.
Oh no!
So-
It's like living with a cat or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, he wasn't, look, he couldn't have been more than 14 months old. Maybe even, it's
Yeah, but
August, 13 months old.
He had the dexterity enough to squat and poop in the shoe.
He was-
there was meditated, Dad. It was
I think he
meditated.
was hiding, yeah. So anyway, I don't know that. And I go in to, put my shoes on. We were going to go, I think, probably play football on the beach or something. And I don't think I actually got my foot in there before I discovered. I think I discovered it before the foot went in. But it was just a big, hilarious joke. Oh, everybody thought that was wonderful, except me.
Oh, man.
Tony's heard the story a few times in his life from the Gallianis when they see him. I remember you.
They watch their shoes when he's around.
Yeah.
All right. It's a good one. Okay, so we are going to talk about, at this time with Tony, is when you decided to go to law school. So how'd that happen? Tell me the story.
I worked a year at the patent office and as a patent examiner, and all of the people I was working with up and down the hall were my age or a year or two older. And they'd come in the mornings laughing and telling stories and having interesting conversations about the cases they had heard about in law school. They were having fun. And the guy I was cubicle mate with, Tom Madden, said, maybe you ought to think about law school. And the patent office had a program then, thank God. They paid for half of the law school. And if you would agree to stay 1 year after they paid for your tuition, it was forgiven. If you left, you had to pay it back. So I took the law school exam and got a very high mark and went to GW because it had, and I believe still does have, the #1 patent law program in the United States. Well, why wouldn't it? It's right near the patent office and it's got access and has for years to really good patent lawyers. Georgetown also has a great program. My friend Joel Freed has taught there for 38 years at night, their program. So, I wasn't really particularly interested in law, but I wanted to know what the hell was going on. These guys were having so much fun at. And I had no intention of leaving the patent office. It wasn't like I'm going to law school so I can be a lawyer and get out of here. I just wanted to go to law school and did.
Okay. And how long was it back then?
Well, if you do it at night, and still is, it's 4 years. Law school full-time is 3 years. But it was an ordeal. It wasn't hard, but it was an ordeal. Because, you work on a full-time job.
And you just got this newborn running around when you come home.
Yeah, and Pat deserves enormous credit. She was a really good supporter by taking care of the kids. And when I studied for exams, and this time I didn't have somebody to cram with, but I'd study with a couple of buddies, we'd take over the house and she'd move with Tony and later Tom out to live with Leo for a week while I crammed. And a lot of that's my own fault because I skipped a lot of classes after the first year when I figured out this wasn't really that hard. But you got to get ready for the exam, make good grade. So,
yeah, it's easier to cram 1 week than go to classes for a year.
Well, some of the classes were really interesting and fun, and the professors were pretty good at night school. But some of them were death, just death.
I'm sure. And deaf, you mean?
Dull.
Dull, okay.
Jesus, God.
Sorry, it got lost in translation there from generation. Let's talk about my brother Tom and him being born. It was January 10th, 1967. Tell me what happened.
Well, first of all, his Pat's mother died August of '66, just before Tom was born. So there was some trauma there before that, but Tom's delivery was much better, I think, than Tony's. I forgot to mention Pat had 21 hours in labor before Tony was born. Tom was much easier. And one of the stories is, how did Tom get his name? I don't think it's in the book, but Pat said to me when I showed up to see her after birth, that what do you want to name him? And she said, I named Tony. She said, or Anthony. I came up with that name, even though we both liked it. What do you want to name him? So I said, I'll think about it tonight, and I'll let you know the next day. And so the next day I get there, she says, do you have a name? I said, yeah. I said, Marcello Mastroianni Mencken Lupo. Marcello Mastroianni was a great Italian actor.
Also a ladies' man. All the ladies loved Marcello.
Yeah, right. And he was always opposite Sophia Loren in their movies. Not always, but often. And Mencken was my favorite writer, H.L. Mencken from the 30s and 40s. So Pat laughed and said, no, seriously, what do you want to name him? And I said, Marcello Mastroianni Mencken Lupo.
That would have been an awesome name, though.
I guess when the time came, she picked the name Thomas, which was a good name.
Is that a family? I can't remember where Thomas is from.
No, I have no idea.
Well, what about Anthony? Is this some sort of a family name?
No.
You guys just chose it out of a baby book back then? It was like, oh, good enough.
Yeah, it's the same way people do pick names now. If they don't find it in the baby book, they make up something that sounds good.
How come you didn't do the traditional Italian thing where you name the son after you, like Raphael?
Again, I'm 23-year-old and I'm
Was it
dumb
go out of
dumb.
fashion? Or?
No, I'm just dumb. And there's no explanation for it. Just really no explanation. There is an explanation for how we got to your name. There's always an explanation of something. For example, Anthony's middle name is Vincent. Supposedly that was naming Tony after me. Tom's middle name is Matthew, naming him after my dad, whose middle name was Matthew. That's extreme to get to that, but that's how you... Then you get to Ted, whose middle name is Stedman. Who has a middle name that's a last name? Ted Stedman, for Leo Stedman. And then Taryn gets Patrick. Pat Lupo. Patrick is a male equivalent of Pat. So, if you want to go down that road, you can kind of say that's how it happened.
What's with giving me an Irish middle name? I mean, it should have been like Pasquale or something.
Yeah, well,
that's Patrick for Italian.
Pasquale, absolutely.
Pasquale.
I'll call you Pasquale from now on.
I think I'm going to get rid of Patrick, and Pasquale should be
Pasquale's fine, yeah.
Doesn't make any sense. I'm not Irish. What is that?
Yeah. So that's it.
All right. And as far as Tom goes, he's born. He's a lot healthier than Tony. You don't have all the
none of the colic stuff, yeah.
And then you guys relocate with him to your first home, really.
Yeah, Leo, after Doris died, Leo sold us the house that he and Doris lived in at a bargain price. I think it was whatever he still owed on the mortgage. And we moved into 2955 Rosemary Lane. And that's where that particular... Falls Church. It's still there.
Wow.
I drove by it just a couple months ago. It's still there.
And that's where this picture's taken. Look how young you look. You're all sharp.
Yeah. I was all of 25 maybe at that point.
Yeah, and
that's Tom's picture and that's Easter Sunday with my mom and dad, Leo, which is Pat's dad, and Tony and me and Tom. And then there's also a picture that was taken by Pat, obviously, and I guess it's not in my book, but there's a picture of her holding him the same day.
And you finally, since you guys have moved to suburbia, you have to get yourself a dog.
Well, it was a
Your
rescue
first
dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that happened.
Well, this woman that I rode with in the carpool to the, I guess, the patent office, told us of a rescue dog, or she called and said, I got a great dog. He's beautiful, and he's a rescue dog, and he's an Irish setter. Never saw him, just said, yes, we'll take him. And he was a great dog. He's very patient with the boys. Of course, all four boys, he lived long enough for all four boys to enjoy him. And I loved him. Picture of him there.
You mentioned that, Tony'd run up to him at full speed and the dog would accept it.
Yeah.
Wasn't scared of a little kid. And that he had a really weird habit of, why don't you tell us about his nuances about couch sitting?
Well, yeah, not just couch, chairs. For whatever strange, he wasn't very bright, but he had a couple of really interesting habits. When he wanted to sit in a chair, he'd get about 4 or 5 feet out from it and then start backing up step by step with his rear toward the chair, almost like a car backs into a parking space. And then when his butt hit the chair, he'd park his butt and sit there like a human. His 2 front feet on the ground, just sit there. That was one habit. Then he was obsessed with flies, and when you have a fly in the house, he would chase the fly, barking at it or snapping at it, and when it would get to the window, the fly's trying to fly out, sees his path out, doesn't know the window's there. The fly's going across the window like this, and there he is going behind it like this, and of course his drool is just drooling all over the window. He had to clean the window when he finished. So
yeah, there's an old black and white, I guess it was 8mm film you had of Guinness and Ted's, I think it's his second or first birthday, and Guinness runs in and steals his cake. Do you remember this film? It's like one of the only surviving, I think it's our first video of our family you have.
It's an 8mm film, yeah, and I think it's Ted's birthday. You can barely see it. And Guinness finishes off the cake after Ted has done his stuff all over his face. So, those are fun years, fun memories of you guys' childhood. But Guinness also, Pat made me a German sweet chocolate cake on one of my birthdays and had it parked on the dining room table at Rosemary Lane. And when we came around the corner, there he was with his front paws propped up on it, eating it. And of course we yelled at him and went all over the rug and everything. Didn't get that cake.
No, probably not.
Well, he was a great dog.
We're going to start here. Let's talk about law school graduation and Ted being born. So I guess you had 2 kids while you were in school, and tell me about how the rest lined up.
Well, let's see. Ted is born on January of 1967, and I graduated law school in 68. So I actually graduated with 3 sons. And the only thing I remember about graduation is I think it's the first time that I actually have my parents attend a graduation. Somehow I skipped having them at my high school and my engineering graduations. Well, for whatever reason, they attended the law school graduation. It was at Lisner Auditorium, and during the process of just about the time before my name was called, your mom sent Tony down from sitting in the back of Lisner Auditorium, and he suddenly plops himself in my lap. Obviously, I couldn't take him up with me, so I had to send him back. Pat came down and picked him up. I can't remember, it's so many years. But what I remember is that I took my parents and Pat, strange choice, but to Luigi's Pizza Restaurant. I had never taken them there before. Pat had been there, but not my parents. So here we are on graduation evening, and we're eating pizza at Luigi's Pizza Restaurant as a celebration of my graduation. Things have changed over the years. Now it's always a big party when somebody graduates anything. And it was a nice memory, though.
Luigi's still there? Is it a real restaurant here?
You know, the answer to that is I'm not quite sure. A year ago, Luigi's was still there, but I heard a rumor that they may have sold out, and that the family, Luigi himself, died in 1978 or somewhere around there, and donated or left his restaurant to his waitresses and cook.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
And where's this at? What road?
19th Street between M&L and Washington. Luigi's was a place that all the way back to high school, we used to go to have beer and eat great pizza, best pizza in Washington. And he was a bald-headed guy who ran the place, who if you had a tie on would come around and cut your tie off and hang it on the wall and give you a free meal.
Strange thing. He's still ties.
Yeah. So anyway, his
What a weird guy.
yeah. When I had my high school reunion 45 years later, it was a very small reunion since I had a small class, but the graduates and their spouses came to Luigi's for an evening of meeting each other. We hadn't met each other in 45 years, the students, but it was still good. I ate there about 2 years ago. It was still great, but I'm not sure it's there anymore after 60 years.
So tell me about Ted being born.
Well, that's an interesting. Each of the four sons, I got an opportunity more and more to participate in the birth. And by the time we got to Ted, I actually got to attend the preparation room where Pat was. And then when it's time to have the birth, I was not allowed in the birth room. And I was probably okay with me at the time because I wasn't sure what happens in there, you know. And having had a past history of watching a film on a lung operation and seeing the blood spurting and everything and kind of getting nauseated, I was probably just as happy I didn't get to go into the room. But the night that he was born, it snowed. And Debbie, at that time, as I recall, we were living in Springfield, and Pat and I riding on the way to the hospital. She's having contractions, and there's somebody in a car who's got a problem. I don't know if it's a flat tire or what. And so Pat, being the good spirit she is, said, let's pull over and help this person. So there she is in contraction sitting in the car, and I'm helping this person in a snowstorm get ready to get the vehicle out. So then Pat and I got to the hospital, and he was an even shorter recovery time than Tom or Tony. So it went well.
Yeah, look at this picture. He looks like a kung fu master.
He does. He's got his hands up, ready to go. Yeah, he was ready to go.
We're still on Ted's birth here. Let's talk about this picture of Tony and Tom holding Ted and the inevitable madhouse of having 3 children.
Unbelievable. You know, whoever thought about the idea that having many children is a good idea didn't get it right. I mean, you get it right in the sense it's wonderful to have them all grown up and doing well. But each one multiplies the problems. But what I'd always heard is if you have the third child, it's like having 6 children. And that was exactly right. Just from my perspective, maybe your mom feels differently, but it suddenly became wild. You know, more noise, more stuff going on. And as they get older, in any 3 siblings, there's switching back and forth of 2 versus 1, or, you know.
The odd man now.
Yeah, and when they're that close, each of you are just 18 months to 2 years close, 2 years apart, that can happen. If you space it and have a lot of space, like you were born 4 years later, it wasn't so much a problem at that point.
When you have multiple kids, I thought, like, when you look at some of these larger families, some of the kids take care of the young kids. Did that happen, or were they just too close in age that they were not caring for each other?
I think, again, many years passed, but my memory is that they all were individually wild. And that they played together. And for example, hopping ahead for a second, I remember you being carried on Tony's back all over the house and on Tom's back and probably Ted's, because you were the baby at that time. I know we're jumping ahead here, but certainly if there was one of them was hurt or something, they'd pay attention. But generally, they each had their own life going on outside the house in terms of their friends, a little different group of friends for each one. And if Tony was taking care of his younger brothers, I don't remember it.
I was just curious. I know maybe that's when you have girls. I don't think guys do that.
Well, I don't know either, but the closeness of age, I think, makes a big difference. Who's mature at 4 with a 1-year-old?
Saying. I think that's the way large families do it. Is they make the kids help out, and
I don't remember anything like that.
All right, so then we started doing the animal collecting. Pat gets another dog, I guess, Edelweiss.
Yeah.
And you want to tell me about that?
Edelweiss was a St. Bernard. Edelweiss, translated at the time from the dictionary, I hope it's correct, as Little White Blossom. And she was a little white, pudgy puppy when we got her. And she grew into an enormous dog, as you might expect from a St. Bernard. Her main goal in life was to slobber. Love you and slobber. So she would run when the kids. She was in the backyard most of the time. We had a fenced backyard. When the kids would go out to play, she was very excited. She stole a puppy at 2, and would just run over and climb on whoever was the slowest runner who didn't make it to the
fence.
No, to the house.
The tree house.
The tree house. The kids would wait by the door watching when she was furthest away, and they'd open the door and run for the treehouse, trying to beat her to the treehouse. Of course, the older ones, like Tony, was going to get there first. If he was 6 by that time, and like Ted, which is 2, he's not going to make it before Edelweiss gets him. So, and whoever was the youngest, 2 or 3 of them were always banged to the ground, and Edelweiss would just stand over them, licking them. It was awful.
But St. Bernard slobber.
St. Bernard slobber. But anyway, so that was just one of many animals.
My mom also brought home a parrot named Bilbo at that time.
Yeah.
Who had been around for, most of my childhood. Bill was there.
He's still alive, too, apparently. Somewhere, someplace he's chasing people that walk in the door and trying to kill them.
You don't have a good memory of that parrot?
He used to eat beer cans. He'd crush them. And he'd go around the top of the kitchen eating off the
crown molding.
The crown molding. And they're very loyal to one person. And so that was Pat's parrot. So women that would walk in with their hair, somehow he got the picture that was a different hairdo or something, and he'd dive bomb them if he was out of the cage.
Yep.
It really was a zoo there, because other dogs were brought home. Muffin, whatever.
Lady Muppet.
Yeah, they were rescued. Some vacation that I wasn't on, that you guys were in Tennessee or something. Yeah. You stopped at a rest stop, and there's this poor dog running around, lost, and you tried to see if anybody owned it and everything. And well, what'd you do? Couldn't find a home for it? Bring it home. So
Muppet was a great dog.
Yeah, they're all really great dogs.
All right, I want the truth of what happened to Edelweiss, because when I was a kid, all of a sudden he just disappeared, and Mom was like, "Oh, he jumped over the fence and ran away."
Didn't jump over the fence, crashed through the fence.
So he really did. He didn't get stolen by somebody.
No. This dog, when there was a lightning storm or a snowstorm, if he didn't get in the house, well, first of all, lightning, he'd come banging on the door, let me in, let me in. And of course, you'd let him in. But we had a bad snowstorm, and they had a house to sleep in the backyard. Edelweiss pushed through under the fence and escaped. Not the first time Edelweiss escaped. There's some Edelweiss stories. But this time, Edelweiss was gone. We couldn't find Edelweiss, and as I recall, called the rescue center, and yeah, who knows what happened to Edelweiss.
I thought maybe this is one of those things you tell little kids where the dog went to the farm, or they disappear.
Not that I remember.
Something like that. Okay,
yeah.
Fair enough.
Push through the fence. That was a strong dog. I mean,
did you try to walk?
Well, the worst Edelweiss story, you got to tell one Edelweiss story. It's not in the book. Get a call from a neighbor on a rainy night. Do you own that goddamn St. Bernard? And I said, hello? Your dog's down here. You better come get it before I shoot it. So I went a block and a half down. Edelweiss had, again, gotten out. I don't know how. Through the fence, probably. And it was raining. And went down to this guy's place or house in the neighborhood and saw a cat, chased the cat up into a tree. This is the story the guy told me. This guy opens the door to let the cat back in the house. The cat comes running in and beats Edelweiss, but Edelweiss gets through the door, mud all over its claws, chasing the cat. The cat goes underneath a sofa, and Edelweiss is, with its muddy paws on this white carpet, plugging to get the cat.
Oh my God.
And,
it sounds like out of a movie.
Oh, Jesus.
The dog destroys the house. Well, muddy dog.
So,
So did you have to make restitution to this guy for his muddy rugs, or what did you do?
I apologized like crazy. I don't remember how we fixed the situation. I'm sure we probably had to go down and clean it or pay for it. But Edelweiss had the IQ of a peanut. I mean, she had all the instincts: chase the cat, chase this, get away from the lightning. But
yeah, I had a dog, Linus, and every time it would lightning, he would walk under and hide his head somewhere, like an ostrich. He'd put it under the couch or put it in a. So this giant dog is sticking out. His head was under something. It was great. We're now back. I want to talk about your legal career. It began in 1969 when you became a solicitor.
Yeah, that was a great event and a really happy moment in my life when I think back on it. I had graduated law school and I was working as a patent examiner. And unlike everyone else who went to law school, I really didn't have a lot of interest in leaving the patent office because I had a great job as a patent examiner. But I got what was called a detail. I was selected to go to the solicitor's office with one other fellow from the patent examining corps, which there were about 1,000 in, to grade the annual patent attorney examinations. And it's a complicated process, but the patent office is the only agency of government that you can't practice before just because you have a law degree. You have to take a special test to show you understand the very complicated rules of patent application process, and you had to have a technical degree to be in the patent office. So anyway, we graded this exam over a 3-month period, and we graded in 2 months, and I had a month left on my details, so I got to help write a brief for the solicitor. That's the main guy. And while that was happening, they put out an ad to add an associate solicitor to the staff. There were 7 attorneys.
Tell us what a solicitor is, because us legal people don't know what you're talking about.
Well, solicitor is a term really comes from the British legal system, and I don't know how it found its way into the U.S. government, but the Solicitor General of the United States, for example, is the head lawyer in I guess it's the Justice Department, and argues all the cases before the Supreme Court. The solicitor in the patent office was the highest officer, legal officer, and you're performing law. You represent the commissioner of patents in all disputes where the commissioner is sued as the official head of the patent office. And the solicitors, the commissioner is sued if by an applicant who doesn't get a patent, thinks the patent examiner handled it and the Board of Appeals that looked at it were wrong in refusing him a patent. So that person has a chance to go to one of two courts and appeal. So the court can look at it and see if the patent office or the commissioner got it right. Commissioner doesn't actually examine those cases. That's an artificial thing. You have to sue in the name of the commissioner, but you're really suing the patent office. So the solicitors, there were 7 of us, handled the several hundred cases that were filed each year in those courts. So, I'm just a couple months out of law school, and I applied for this position. There were 34 applicants. I've truly thought I had no chance to get it. The youngest person they'd ever hired for this position was 24. Somebody had been in they were all patent examiners who were lawyers who had been in the patent office for a long time, had good careers, and they were selected for these. It was really a pretty high-level position. But for whatever reason, I was selected. So here I was at, 1968, 69, 27, 28 years old, being selected to this position, 14 years younger than anybody else. And it was really quite an honor, and I think a surprise to a lot of people, who never thought that I would have that opportunity, or anybody my age. It's very different today, by the way, but that's the way it was back then. And so it was a fantastic job. I got to actually argue my first case in court within 6 months after going in there, maybe age 28, 29, and handle my first trial at 28, 29. And that's very different than private practice, where you may spend 4 to 10 years working with others who are much more senior, who are presenting cases in court. So it was a fabulous opportunity.
So you got to start actually going to trial work almost in your late 20s, when that was almost unheard of. Nobody got that kind of experience that young.
Well, I can't say nobody,
But I mean,
because there might be in state courts and, divorce cases and stuff like that. But no.
In patent law.
In patent law, this was incredibly unusual.
What was, I think you messed up earlier. You said that like the normal job, most people are getting it at 24. I think you meant
42.
I think you reversed it. Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I got it at 28.
You're about 10 years younger than
14 years younger than anybody had ever gotten it.
And you're actually getting real experience arguing cases.
Absolutely.
Do you remember what your first big case was?
Yeah. I remember my first argument. Well, okay, my first district court case involved, you never forget these. You ask any lawyer their first case, they'll remember. My first district court case involved what looked like a big eggshell container that was a steam bath. They give you a simple case first. And you put in the steam bath and you crank it up, and the person sits in there, sweats, and comes out. And so this inventor thought he was the first one to invent this. He wasn't. Patent office rejected him. He appealed to district court for the trial, and I presented the patent office position on that. So I had to cross-examine their witness, make the argument. What was significant about it is that the judge who was handling it his last name was Holsoff, Judge Holsoff, and he wrote a very significant treatise that was used in most of the courts and taught in most of the law schools around the country on evidence, courtroom evidence. And he was a stickler. He was only about 4'6". You could see him barely over the bench that he sat behind, this desk. And so before I went into this first trial, I went to the solicitor, the head guy, and said, "What's he like?" And he said, "Listen, just sit up straight. Do not lean back in your chair. do not look like you're bored, and do exactly the right rules of evidence when you present something, and you'll survive. And so, I was kind of half scared. They sent me in with one of the other assistant solicitors just in case I panicked, I guess. And so my opponent gets up and starts putting on his witness, who was the inventor, and he hands up about the third exhibit, and Holzoff very shakily says, "How many of those you got? How many of those exhibits you got?" And Ted Raptus was his name. He says, "Oh, I got maybe about this many." And Holzoff looks at him and says, I will not consider anything more than 1 inch. So you take 5 minutes and go figure out which documents you're going to use for evidence and which you're not. So there's a pause. So Ted Raptus, of course, he's shaking a bit. It might have been his first case. He was much older, though. And I'm sitting over there thinking, holy shit, my time's coming here. He's going to chew into me. So anyway, to make a long story short, won the trial. I did what I had to do. I did it as short and concise a time as possible, my examinations. So it wasn't like it was a huge trial looking at it years later, but it was a huge trial to me as a first trial. So the funny thing about Holzoff, I'm dragging on here, but I passed the Virginia bar with a high enough mark that you could get moved into the DC bar without ever having to take it.
Oh.
But it required that the application form had to be signed by one judge who knew you. Well, I only knew one judge at that time. So again, I'm scared to death. I go down to this guy's office, his secretary, when I tell her what I'm there for, she says, fine. And I go in, and here's this little guy sitting in this chair. He's 82 years old. And he looks at me and he says, I remember you. He says, that was the eggshell steam bath, wasn't it? And I said, yes, Your Honor. And you don't have to say Your Honor in a courtroom, but I'm saying in his private room, yes, Your Honor. And he says, it was your first case, wasn't it? I'm thinking, oh, shit. Yeah, I showed that much, huh? And I said, yes. And he said, you did all right. You did all right. So that was nice, okay? So then he proceeds to lean back in his chair, put his hands behind his head, says, I remember my first trial.
Oh.
And he was so old that at the time in the state he was in, he did not have to take the bar. You could go to a law firm and get your training in law firm. He proceeded to tell me about his examination of the most important witness in that first trial, some 60 years after it had happened. And that's why I said to you earlier, I don't think you ever forget your first trial. And the first appellate argument I had, I substituted. I had already written briefs in cases, but they hadn't come up for argument. But one of the associate solicitors got married, and he was on his honeymoon, so they needed someone to argue his case. So 2 days before, they gave me the briefs, and I saw everything, and I went in and argued the case. And that was on floating glass, how you made glass hard, floating it, so you didn't have to run it through machines. And that was okay. I mean, that was exciting too.
Now we come to the most important part of your book, and obviously the most important part of your life. I was born.
It's true.
October 1st, 1973.
Yeah.
And why don't you tell me what a grandest event that was, and how it changed your life and made you fulfilled?
Actually, it was a great event. We sit and joke about it. You're the only one of the 4 brothers I saw being born. I actually go into the birth room and watch you being born, watch you get your butt slapped and do your first cry and chopped off. All the things.
Appreciate that one. Thanks so much.
And all those things that are so common today. I've seen several births since, grandkids. So it was exciting. That was very exciting. And your name, Taryn, was you were actually the 4th T, but really the 3rd T, because Tony is really Anthony. But all of these T's first names were popping into the world, and now we have Taryn, who's named after the Tarrings, Tarring, who were very close friends of ours, Hank Tarring. So there you were, and your brothers welcomed you. You were a little more in distance. You were 4 years past younger than Ted. It's a great picture that I found of you guys a couple of years ago. The three brothers actually looking like they cared, holding
really.
you.
Tom and Ted are like plotting in this picture. They're looking like, we gotta flush this baby. And Tony's just giggling like, yeah. But, they were up to something.
Yeah, and it was good. It was good. And of course, the confusion in the house went up another level.
But I was a good kid. I didn't do nothing.
You were a good kid. You were a great kid. No, you were a great kid. And all the brothers were great at that age. It's later on when they
so like when do kids sour? What age do you need to start looking out?
Oh, I think it varies from child to child. Not speaking to the four of you, but observations after this point in my life is the great years for raising children are somewhere between 2 and 8. And after 8, they're sucked in by New York marketing over the television to own every toy in the universe and to dress a certain way if you're a girl, maybe even a boy. And kids, doesn't mean they're still not beautiful and lovable, but they lose their innocence, in my opinion, as the television takes over their life. And also not just the television, but their other friends who are watching television, who are dressing in the latest Star Wars outfit or have the latest big wheel toy that's a little different than what you have. So the competition begins. And I think as we grow up, we're subjected to more dirtiness. If you have good parents, they're not going to raise you to be bigoted. They're not going to raise you to be evil. But when you start in school, and maybe by the time you're 8, 9, you're worried about getting beaten up by somebody else who threatens you, some other kid, or competed against or made fun of because your ears are too big, like I was as a kid. I think the children change, that's all.
Well, they learn more from their friends they hang out with than their parents. All that stuff you're trying to keep them away from is exactly what we learn. And you end up spending more time with your friends than your parents if you send them to government school, you're there 8 hours a day.
Absolutely. The other thing, too, we haven't talked about, and maybe comes later in the book, but I'm going to hit it right now, is the importance of someone at home when the kids come home from school. Your mom worked several days a week to make money while I was in the government. And somewhere we hired help for several years, somewhere around when Tony maybe was 8 and Ted was 4. I'm guessing the years, I might be a little off. Leo picked up a day or two a week of that. And then Leo, who's the grandfather, really became a third parent. And he taught the boys right and wrong. And as we go into this story and I go into government or into private practice, I'm with the children less and less. Your mom's working almost full time. And, you got to have I don't think you have to have, but it helps to have a parent at home with the children when they come from school. And if not a parent, a grandparent or a really good caregiver.
Yeah, because on the flip side, when I grew up, nobody was really home except Pop would come by once in a while, Leo. And it's a trade-off. Like, as a kid, I loved that my parents weren't around. But the flip side is you don't have, like, a normal parenting experience.
Right.
Like, you're cooking your own food, you're doing whatever. So It's a trade-off. I think as a kid, I really enjoyed it. But now as an adult, I kind of wish I had more of that. I don't know. I can't imagine what those kids today do. That's when we're old, when we can say what those kids today. Okay, so we are going to take a look at some of these pictures. These are a shot of you have as the family as we're a little older.
Yeah, the annual picture. We sent a picture to family and friends at the end of each year, and that's one of my favorites. But it's always of the four boys. It was always an ordeal because I'm there with the camera trying to get them four boys to all look at the camera. And your mom's saying, "Smile, smile, smile." She's over on the side, and I'm saying to her, "Please, let me just control this." And somebody's cracking jokes, and that's why I love that photo. There's not any one of the four of you paying any attention to me or to your mom. Somebody must have told a joke or cut the cheese or something. But they're the four of you just bursting out. It's a great photo.
Yeah, it's funny. Ted's trying to get us back on track. It's like, hey, none of us care.
Yeah.
And then we had the absolute coolest treehouse in the neighborhood. Everybody came over to play with this thing. I guess you started building this in maybe 69, 70.
Right.
And at that time, for the young kids that are watching this, space was a real big deal. Like people were having, they just landed on the moon. People were always having these space themed parties. So I guess that's why we built a rocket ship treehouse, or what was the idea of this?
Well, I never heard it called a rocket ship treehouse, but that's a very good description of it. Looking at it,
it does look like a rocket ship.
Actually, the whole story about that was we moved into that house where the other houses in the neighborhood hadn't been constructed, and it was pretty easy to get some 2x4s that had been discarded and this and that. And your granddad, that's his contribution to family for decades, is right there. He, of course, was a design engineer, an architectural engineer, and he wanted to design this thing with a tree going up through the center of the roof. Now, if you do that, and the tree is leaning, so it's a leaning tree, you got to do the geometry of where to plant, where to put the post up to hold it, what happens when the tree's blown, what happens as it grows, etc. So he designed this treehouse with his drawings, which I don't have. And he and I and Pop, your other granddad, we built this thing. And we roofed it. We did the whole thing. And so for almost 10 weekends in a row, I guess, we were out there on Saturday and Sunday building this thing. And it became the neighborhood play area because for the next 2 decades at least, that thing, every kid in the neighborhood played in that treehouse.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was it. And
the treehouse was around so long that it had supports that went into the tree, and the tree actually grew around the wood supports. It was really cool. It was like sleeve it. I think it was still up until a few years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say it probably went out 40 or 50 years. I don't know. It might still be there. I don't know.
I don't know either. We'll have to look. Yeah. But that was the coolest tree fort. And so tell me all about Jim Denny.
Well, somewhere after I'd been in the job I loved, the job of a lifetime, the solicitor's office, this guy, Jim Denny, from the Energy Research Development Administration, which had been the Atomic Energy Commission, came into my office and said, I want you. I want you to come out to, and it was a government job, come out to ERDA, E-R-D-A, and head the patent group out there, and offering you the position of Deputy Assistant General Counsel. He was General Counsel for patents. I became the Deputy Assistant. I didn't want to go. He took me to lunch 3 times, fed me martinis at each lunch. You drink martinis back then. If I drank one of those now, I'd pass out. And finally, the 3rd time, said, "Well, are you going to come or not? Not only that, I'm going to give you the highest possible grade you can get in the government at your age." Because he could do that. So I got what was a GS-16 at that time. At 36 or 37 years old, it was like the top salary. Not a lot of money because it's government, but the top salary. It was a $10,000 raise over what I was getting. And even an offer that they'd give us $20,000 toward moving out to Gaithersburg, where this was. Well, I took a trip out to Gaithersburg, and So I stayed in Springfield and commuted to Gaithersburg for the next 3 years. And I was in charge of 85 patent lawyers, 30 or so at the department itself, and the rest at the 7 or 8 national laboratories, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, what else? Lawrence Livermore, Brookhaven, the one in Chicago, what's the name? I forget now. So for 3 years, I ran that program, and I was in charge of bringing the first lawsuit that the government would ever file against a private company for use of its patents, where they had refused to license or pay. But more importantly, I handled a couple of very big cases. Jim Denny was a great friend, became a great friend, as well as a couple other fellows who I've worked with ever since. Paul Davinsky, Jack Lever was my partner for many years, and it was a great thing. We worked out of Gaithersburg. We were on a golf course, in a building on a golf course. We would run 3 to 6 miles each day. I was doing a lot of running, used to run 10Ks and 10 milers on various weekends. And we'd do that at lunch and shower and then come back and work.
So, for comparison, how many hours do you work for a government job compared to when you went into private practice? What's your daily hours and what's that?
A little bit hard to answer, but let me answer it versus the solicitor's office is a little clearer because I traveled so much for the Department of Energy, you could count those hours as working hours, even though they weren't. But you could, because they took you away from the house.
They took you away from the family.
Yeah. But the solicitor's office, I probably worked an 8 or 9 hour day. And in the jobs that I had, which we haven't talked about yet, in private industry, when I had a trial coming up 4 to 6 months before, I'd work 6 days a week, 16-hour days. And during the trial, just 20, 30 days in a row getting ready for it and doing the trial of 16, 18-hour days, 7 days a week. It was exhausting. And it's just a huge difference. So the happiest, the best time I can say I ever had with my family and children, the 4 sons, was during the government days, because I had time. Even at the Department of Energy, I coached basketball teams, swim teams, including 5 in the morning a.m. practices on Sunday morning in the winter. And I had hobbies, sailing, took you guys sailing. I had a lot of things that I was doing that were fun. And then within a year after going into private practice, that just was gone. And it's just an enormous difference. But I left because I had to. I had 4 sons, and Tony was coming up to college age soon. And the government salary had been frozen for 3 years in a row at a time when inflation was, under Carter, President Carter, was 13% a year. So if you think about that, over a 3-year period, whatever salary I was making, and say it was $59,000, suddenly was 40% less due to inflation.
And that inflation's brutal.
It was brutal. I had
never heard of that high.
People were getting mortgages at 14 and 16% of their houses. It was unbelievable. So anyway, there it is.
Well, also you mentioned about Walden Glen. Now, that's a swimming pool near us, I guess, named after Walden.
Yeah.
And you had a lot to do with that.
Right. I was one of 7 people who organized the 2 communities. Ours was Point of Wood. The one next to it was Walden Glen. The pool was going to be in Walden Glen. That's how it's got its name. And we solicited 300 houses and families to join something that didn't exist, that would be built, a swim club. And so once we got that money in, we contracted with Paddock Pools. And interestingly, looking back on it, how dollars have changed. We built that whole pool structure with a bathhouse for about $70,000. It's incredible when I think about that, what it would cost today. Because we're talking about a pool that was Olympic-sized lanes, competition lanes. In fact, I ran a lot of the swim meets. I forget what the title was called, but the guy who runs it, who blows the whistle, who announces the next rate, not one of the line judges. I did that for a year. And
It was a great pool. I spent a lot of time at Welland
it's a
Glen.
great
And
pool.
it actually was one of the only pools that had a high dive, a real high dive.
Yeah,
You could go off of. And I actually was on dive team for a short time because of that. That was fun.
good.
But how did you get into basketball? Like, I kind of missed you playing basketball. Did you play as a kid?
Oh, yeah. Okay. When you say it, yeah. First of all, when I went to the boys' school, Woodward School, they had a basketball team, even though it was a very small school. And to go to that school, because my parents didn't have a lot of money, I was given a half scholarship based on me being, and I think I talked about this earlier, the football team and basketball team manager.
Right.
What they meant by that is that you picked up all the dirty clothes of the football team for practice, made sure they got into the washing machines, and serviced and put them back out for the next practice. So the same kind of thing on the basketball team. I'd never really played, but I liked it, and so I volunteered to just kind of step in. In the second year, I did that, and I made the team. Not very good, but I made it. And by the third or fourth year, I was playing regularly. So, there's a great love of basketball. There is no better game to play. I never played lacrosse or rugby, so you got to say that. No better game to play that I've ever played, including tennis, which I now love, that's better than basketball. And so when the kids were growing up, the four sons, Taryn unfortunately missed it because of my private practice, but I took them at 8 years old and volunteered to be one of the coaches for the for the teams, and was their basketball coach. Taught them basketball. Took the teams each year and played in the leagues.
That's okay. I was just curious how that happened. I didn't know that you had played in high school.
Yeah.
This concludes Chapter 6. If you missed any of the previous chapters and would like to go backwards, just click the box that's appearing now. It'll take you to a playlist to choose what chapter you want. Otherwise, just stay tuned and it should roll into Chapter 7. Now, if you're watching this today and I just made this story, it might take a week or two for 7 to come out. So if there's no 7, just be patient and come back.